A twist on the tale of the discoveries of Columbus, Copernicus, Brahe, Kepler, and Galileo, the thoughts that changed the world, and the world that changed the thoughts. This is part 2. Part 1 is about Columbus. If you haven't watched it, please go to my YouTube channel and watch it. It might be good to watch them in order, although I think they are independent. Part 2 is going to be about Copernicus. Part 3 is Brahe and Kepler. And part 4 is Galileo, with a little surprise at the end. The next individual that I wanted to talk about in this presentation is Nicholas Copernicus. Chronologically, after Columbus, very close to Columbus, Copernicus issued a first paper on his observations about the movement of the celestial bodies in 1517. Interestingly, the same date when Martin Luther, is posting his 92 theses on Wittenberg Cathedral, which I will be touching on later. Copernicus lived his whole life in the Catholic environment. His sister was a nun. His brother was also a Catholic priest, and he actually studied theology. He was studying the canon law, and he was never married. It's not understood clearly if he actually wanted to take the vows or not, but he was very, very religious. And we will see how, in this environment, what his observations were telling him were a bit in contradiction with what the Christian and especially Catholic Church were saying. So, how does Copernicus deal with this and what does he do? As you can see, it took him almost 30 years to actually publish his book in a more comprehensive way. So, let's talk about Copernicus a little bit. We're moving to the 1500s in Europe. By now, the Ottoman Empire is expanding. It is coming to the west, and it's not only expanding. The most prominent figure in the 1500s of the leaders of Ottoman Empire is Suleiman the Magnificent. He was not only a great strategist, but he was also an educator. He was a scientist, and he also was a poet. He was a very rich individual in many different senses. He was very open to Europe. Of course, his religion was Muslim, but here's a painting of him by Titian near 1530. This is key because in the past, according to the Muslim tradition, there were no icons, there were no paintings of individuals, and they had a very different idea. But he wanted to be open to the West and also make sure that all of the riches from the East were available. He really opened up the Ottoman Empire and Istanbul as a great center for cultural exchange. And he was extremely powerful, obviously, also with a very powerful army. We have in the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Emperor is now from the House of Habsburg. And what I'm depicting here is Charles V of Germany, who became the Holy Roman Emperor very soon in the early 1500s, also painted by Titian around 1533. We have in France the House of Valois, and represented by Francois I of France. He was a cultural man. He also was very Christian. He was fighting constantly against Henry VIII to be the most Christian king of Europe. And also, he was fighting with Suleiman on many different terrains. Now, interesting, also painted by Titian in 1539. one of the characteristics of Francois the First of France is that he was very much driven to culture. After the unsuccessful attempts by Leonardo da Vinci to be funded and sponsored by the different principados in Italy, it was Francois the First who actually welcomed him, invited him to France. Leonardo died in Paris. He died with the Mona Lisa, under his bed, and a lot of the paintings by Leonardo are in the Louvre in France because that's where he had them, that's where he painted them, and Francois very it's very well known, didn't actually ask anything from Leonardo. He just wanted Leonardo, he revered him, he honored him as a painter, and he also sponsored many others. So, right after the time of the Medici in Florence, Francois the First of France was probably one of the great crowns that sponsored and really focused on culture and art. And his court was very well known for being very educated and highly cultural, a very strong personality, same as Charles V and Suleiman. They're all contemporaries, very strong personalities. And of course, in Spain, the king of Spain is now from the House of Habsburg. He is the grandson of Isabella and Fernando from the Catholic kings of Spain. He is the son of Juana, the daughter of Isabella and Fernando. And very interestingly, he became the Holy Roman Emperor. His father was from the House of Habsburg, and that's how the lineage of Habsburg is established with a very strong presence in Europe. By being also the Holy Roman Emperor and having his paternal side being the Austrian archdukes, there's a lot of terrain and power that Charles V is having, very strong Catholic influence. And of course, in England, we have the Tudors, especially more specifically Henry VIII. And later on, he's going to have his three children become the king and the two queens of England, the Tudor dynasty. And it is very interesting that they were very strong figures. They all had a lot of conflicts between them. Of course, Henry VIII is married to Catalina de Aragon. Catalina is the aunt of Charles V. Catalina is the youngest daughter of Isabella and Fernando. And when Henry VIII wants to divorce Catalina de Aragon, his first wife, he needed a papal bull for a dispensation. And of course, the popes they did follow what the Holy Roman Emperor would say. And the Holy Roman Emperor is not only extremely Catholic, he is the nephew of Henry VIII's wife, and he's the cousin of Mary Tudor, the first daughter. He doesn't want to allow this divorce and basically make his own kissing cousin a bastard. So there's a lot of different powers between the great houses of Europe. And of course, we have the Pope in Rome. And in the 1500s, we have for the first time the Medici popes. So during the 1400s, the Medici bankers created a lot of power, and they also were very focused in culture, and they achieved by the 1500s to place the Medici in the seat of Rome. So depicted here by Rafael Sanzio. In the middle is Pope Leo X, who is Giovanni Medici. He is the youngest son of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo el Magnifico. In the back, on the right of the painting, by the left of Pope Leo, is his cousin Giulio de' Medici, who became Clement VII. So these two popes during the 1500s had a lot to do with all of the differences in the religion during this time, turbulent time in Europe. And, Clement VII, who's Giulio de' Medici in this painting depicted on the right back of the painting, is actually the one who keeps denying Henry VIII his divorce, based on the influence from Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So there's a lot of play here between the great heads of state, and it's a very turbulent time. It's important to say that, in addition, we have the Poland and Lithuania very, very close. They had been joined together. And Alexander the First, of Jangelion, he is Lithuanian, but he becomes the king of Poland. And this is going to be during the time of Copernicus. Very Catholic and, very Christian, but especially with very Catholic influence. And this is important to say because in the 1500s, there's going to be a lot of religious turmoil. So in the 1500s, we have the Holy Roman Emperor from the House of Habsburg, extremely Catholic. We have a Christian divide. The Roman Catholic Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor are basically very much centered in the Papal States and Rome with the Catholic Church. But there had been some sort of an abuse of the Catholic power by many popes, but it seems in historical records that Pope Leo X, who was Giovanni Medici, really sort of did a bit too much. Of course, he started the building of the Vatican building, who's that, it's a tremendous, beautiful building, but it cost a lot of money. And he also had lavish dinners and extreme extravaganzas, and all of that was being paid by the Catholic individuals. And so Luther posts his thesis, his 92 thesis, at the door of Wittenberg Cathedral in 1517. Here is Martin Luther in the only painting known by Lucas Cranach the Elder. Uh, Martin Luther was really just basically saying we have very poor Catholics. They're giving all their monies in exchange of indulgences. This is not fair. When he traveled to Rome, he saw a lot of things that, in his opinion, were wrong. But he was theologian, and what he found that was wrong was not the theology, was not necessarily the Christian dogma, it was the Catholic Church. So he really started fighting against the Catholic Church and going for the word of the Bible. In his mind, it was very important to translate it and make sure that people understood in their own languages what the Bible really said, and try to fight against what was happening. His intention was not to break with the church. His intention was to raise the flag and say we should mend the ways. But his strong views were taken in Europe by many other people that found some sort of encouragement in also breaking with the Roman Catholic Church. So, very notably, around 1533, after years of trying to get a dissolution and divorce from his first wife, Henry VIII finally is convinced by Thomas Cromwell to actually create the Anglican Church. So Thomas Cromwell is known to have been a Protestant, following more of Luther and Calvin dogma and principles. Henry VIII was not. He was actually a very Catholic individual. He had written several thesis on the Catholic Church. And when he separated, he basically created the Anglican Church, whereby the head of the church is not the Pope in England, is not the Pope, is the King of England. He does not respond to the Pope. And other than that, the rest of the um, dogma is basically very Catholic. He is much less of a dissenter compared to Martin Luther or Calvin. Calvin was probably even stronger views on his Protestantism. He's from Switzerland, but his ideas really took hold. Even for Luther, Calvin was probably a bit too much in terms of his interpretation of the theology and the practices and what people should do. And he starts having a very strong response to Catholic Church. All of these Christian divide is starting to take hold with basically the middle of Europe. Uh, Protesting against the Catholic Church, and you have very strong Catholicism in Spain, in France, and in Poland. So basically, the Protestant movement is surrounded by the more Catholic states, and this is bringing a lot of mayhem and a lot of very bloody century of Christians killing Christians. The Inquisition, which had been formed in France in the 1300s, was refocused in the 1500s. Very famously is known as the Spanish Inquisition at the end of the 1400s, but in the 1500s it really took hold, and it was really very much focused to burning Protestants that they called the non-Catholic heretics. For them, it was much worse to be a Protestant, which was basically born out of Catholicism and was criticizing theology of Catholicism rather than being of any other religion. And of course, this also led to the massacre of Saint Bartholomew in 1574 in Paris. What you see here is a depiction of France, and coming out from the Louvre is the queen, who is Catalina de' Medici. She is um, um, the daughter of a cousin of Clement VII and Leo X. So she is from that branch of the family, very, very Catholic. And she is actually very close to the De Guise family, who are, of course, related to Mary Stuart of Scotland. And they were very Catholic, but not just very Catholic. They actually did plot this particular event on St. Bartholomew's Day in the year 1574, and they really basically encouraged a massacre of citizen versus citizen, where the Catholics on the streets of Paris were allowed to kill all the Huguenots, Protestants who had come for the marriage of Henry IV, who was Henry Valois, a Huguenot, to the daughter of Catalina de Medicis, the Queen Margot. And this was a very shocking event that really resonated with the rest of Europe, culminating in a century, basically, of horrible Christian massacres and killings among the different Catholics and the different Protestant churches. And in all this uncertainty, violence, and fear, we actually have the resonance also of the new knowledge that had been coming during the past centuries from the Eastern cultures, with knowledge from Asia. And there had been a renaissance of technology and science, not just art, in the previous century. There had been the discovery of America, of new worlds. So on one hand, we have a world that is sort of supporting observation, experimentation, thinking, and on the other hand, we have a terror of religion wars and fear of expressing many times your opinions against the church because nobody really knew what could happen to them. So it's a very bloody century and very, very interesting how these two different um, trends are colliding in actually a very contradicting environment. On one hand, fostering thinking and knowledge and arts and culture, and on the other hand, uh, with terrible uh, punishments for the way that people would think or for the way that people would actually be following one or another religion. So it is within this very intolerant religious environment in Europe, together with the drive for scientific knowledge, that Nicholas Copernicus is living and is doing his research. As I mentioned, he is in Poland, a very Catholic country, and he comes from a very Catholic family. And what he's interested in, among many other things, is on the movements of the celestial bodies. And by using hypothetical mathematical models and calculations, he achieves what he calls a heliocentric model for the solar system. So, where's he coming from? The Ptolemaic geocentric model from the second century of our Common Era places the Earth in the middle with circular orbits around the Earth of the different celestial bodies, including the Sun. Of course, the concept was that all of these bodies were moving around the Earth. It is not very difficult to understand this model, how it came about, because we are on Earth, we don't feel that we're moving, and we do see the celestial bodies that are moving around the Earth very clearly. We see the sun rising on the east and setting on the west and moving around the Earth, same as the moon, and the other celestial bodies had different patterns of movement. Now, the different patterns of movement of the other bodies from the perspective of the Earth were very, very hard to follow. They are not as easy to describe, and this is one of the reasons that motivated Nicholas Copernicus into doing some mathematical calculations and try to see if he could achieve a model that would be simpler in the terms of how the celestial bodies move. And that's how he found out and achieved the heliocentric model, and basically said, placing the sun in the center of the solar system, the movement of the celestial bodies is much more simple and easier to understand. So, from observation and experimentation, we get a geocentric model. I'm saying experimentation because we all observed every single day of our lives that the sun rises in the east, goes across the skies, and sets in the west. And this is something we can experiment with. We can actually predict it. We can actually measure it. So, from observation, uh, our senses and our calculations are telling us that the sun moves around the earth. It's the most logical observation, the most logical conclusion to draw. So the problem is that when we start looking at some of the different movements of the different celestial bodies, it becomes very complex. So in the geocentric model, the retrograde movement is explained in in these two cartoons, but the one that I just showed on the left. Imagine that we are on the Earth, and we know that we are really moving around the sun. But if we don't know that from the Earth, the way that we see planet Mars, the red planet that is also moving around the sun, But if we look at it from the standpoint of the Earth, the movements are making a loop. They go from A to B to C to D to E to F and G. This is the apparent retrograde movement that this particular planet Mars would be actually having if we look at it from the Earth and we assume that the planet Mars is actually moving around the Earth. It is quite complicated, and it actually leads to several different explanations and diagrams. This is the diagram of how Mercury was moving. The diagram for Venus on a span of 7 years is a bit more complex, but it's the famous pentagram, which, there's 5 points to that star. And taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica first edition in 1771, this is how only the Sun, Mercury, and Venus would look like from the Earth. So, as you can imagine, the geocentric system and model was based on observation. It was rather logical. It prevailed for many centuries. And it was very complicated. It was really hard to understand and to keep tracing through time how the different, the known 7 planets of the solar system would move, including the sun that was supposed to be moving around the Earth. So it is with this system that Copernicus is dealing with. And what is great is that in his publication, he does a lot of mathematical calculations, and the beauty and simplicity of his results are great. Now, in his book, which has actually a very, very long title, but in his book in 1543, when he finally published this, very interestingly, his premise from the beginning is that he states, we know this is not true. We do know that the Earth is at the center. I mean, he is truly a Catholic believer. And then he goes on saying, what's very interesting is that hypothetically, if we place the sun at the center of this universe, look how funny this is. It would look like a much simpler system that we know not to be true. So, did he really believe that his results were not true? Was his Catholic religion so strong? Probably. He did live in a very interesting environment, and his calculations are beautiful, beautiful mathematics, and he really published his book as a mathematical exercise, simplifying what the system would look like if it were heliocentric. So there were some inaccuracies still in his calculations that come from the Ptolemaic system. So we know today that the orbits are not circular. He also mentioned about the epicycles and uniform speeds for all of these countries. But in essence, the innovations of his system is that the Earth, it's one of several planets that is moving around the sun. And by just doing this, by placing the Earth in the right order of the orbits after Mercury and Venus with the sun in the center, he actually could describe the 3 motions of the Earth. He also could explain that there was no such a thing as retrograde motion. All of the planets were moving in the same direction, looking at them from the sun as the center. And also, he did determine that the distance from the Earth to the Sun is smaller compared to the distance from the Sun to the stars, which in the geocentric system was not the case. So this is an innovation. It took a great hypothetical thinking and very skilled mathematics to come up with this. This is something that to me is always striking. It really has resonated with what means to reason things and try to not be biased by a lot of elements around us, but really say, what is the data and what am I seeing with the data? Even if I don't like what the data is telling me, what is the data telling me? So, an innovator in the 1500s in a very difficult religious environment. Now, I want to take you to the 2nd century before Christ. Aristarchus' writings are not available. We haven't found them, at least. So were they destroyed, or we might be able to find them in some archaeological finding. But what we do have is the quote by Archimedes, now in the 2nd century before Christ, who's quoting Aristarchus' work. And what he's saying is that Aristarchus is hypothesizing that the sun and the stars are fixed, they don't move. That is the earth that revolves around the sun, and also that the sun is in the middle of this orbit, and that the sphere of the fixed stars has the same center as the sun, and it's greater than before it was believed. We do know from Archimedes that Aristarchus's hypothesis was dismissed. For centuries, the Ptolemaic system, now in the 2nd century of our era. So for centuries after that, the Ptolemaic system actually sustained the center as the Earth, a geocentric center. And Aristarchus's thinkings were a bit lost, although there's some Islamic texts that seem to support this idea and bring it back. The reality is that in most of the world, the idea and the system that was followed was the geocentric system. So, did Copernicus know about Aristarchus? Did Copernicus know about Archimedes? Even if he did, his calculations are well documented. So, even if he took a potential idea, what he did was to actually make the calculations and get to the bottom of the system based on a mathematical model that would explain how it worked in a very simple way. So, when I talked about Columbus, I did mention he's the explorer of the unknown. There may have been information available to him about lands on the west. He probably did know about the Azore Islands in the Middle Atlantic. There was a technology by the caravels, but he put all of the best of the available technology and knowledge. He found the funds in the appropriate courts, even though it took him a long time, and he went taking risks to go beyond the expected. The way that I see Copernicus is that he used science to understand the world, and it's in a very difficult environment. I cannot undermine the importance of the of the high intolerance that had been boiling in Europe in the 1500s within the different Christian denominations. And in this environment, there's also the injection of knowledge and science from the 14th century and Renaissance. So he is in Poland, a very strong Catholic in his principles, but also this very important drive to use his mind to think and calculate by mathematical modeling, use his imagination, and simplify a model that for centuries had been extremely, extremely difficult to understand. This was part 2 of a 4-part presentation, and these are basically recommended references that I used for the whole 4 parts. If you haven't watched the other parts, please go to my YouTube channel and watch them, especially at the end of part 4. I think there's a little surprise that you may not have anticipated. Thank you for watching.